My name's Debbie Handley. You'll mostly receive emails from me about nudging you to join things and asking for feedback. I do work for Tyfu Cymru around the vegetable network and the Welsh Flowers network, but also there'll be some new networks in development as well. Just a bit of housekeeping. You can, if you put yourselves on mute while Lucie's talking, that's really helpful because it just makes it easier to hear. We don't pick up background noise. And also, if you want to keep your camera on, please do. If you want to put it off, then put it off. It's completely up to you. You'll be aware that Tyfu Cymru offers 100% funded support through these kind of events, through workshops, training, but there's also an opportunity for one-to-one sessions with Lucie if this is something that you want to look at in more detail. If you do want to do that, then either tell us at the end, put it in the chat, or just drop me an email or drop Tyfu an email and we can set that up for you, no problem. You will have mostly completed the online business reviews, I think, which enables you to be able to access all of these sessions. So thank you for doing that, and hopefully you found that useful. There's an opportunity for questions midway through. You can put them in the chat box, or you can actually ask questions at the end as well, directly to Lucie, if you would rather ask her those questions. We've had some sent to us in advance as well, so I'll go over those at the end. Thank you. And I suppose without further ado, then I will hand you over to Lucie. She's a chartered town planner of 20 years. We're delighted to have her because this subject's come up so many times. Thank you, Lucie. And this webinar will set out the current planning regime around polytunnels and other structures that commercial growers may need on site. So it will be recorded, it will be put onto the Knowledge Hub, and I think Lucie's got some information fact sheets that will go on there as well. So without further ado, I'll hand you over. Thanks, Lucie.
Thanks very much, Debbie. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. As Debbie said, I'm Lucie Taylor. I actually work for Social Farms and Gardens, and I do a few hours a week for LANTRA, or the Tyfu Cymru programme. So it's a bit of a partnership that we've got at the moment, providing advice and training on planning issues, which enables me to provide a bit of one-to-one advice as well. Just to say that there's some resources on the CLAS Wales pages, my community land advisory service, the programme I run most of the week. And as Debbie's mentioned, things will go on the Knowledge Hub as well. But there'll be two fact sheets to accompany this session. One on how whether you need planning permission, and the other one on navigating the getting planning permission, I should say. So they'll be on the Knowledge Hub for LANTRA, and they'll go on the Social Farms and Gardens web page as well. So what we're going to talk about today, we've got a few slides and quite a bit to get through, but I'm going to define to you what is development, and that's sort of the starting point really for whether you might need planning permission. Then we'll talk about permitted development rights that certain developments have. And then we will talk a little bit about change of use and whether you need planning permission for that. Then there'll be questions on, whether you need planning permission. And then we'll move on then to getting planning permission and how to sort of navigate the planning process a little bit, and some of the sort of policy that's relevant. And then we'll have some final questions at the end. So moving on quickly, what is development? Well, development is anything really that is a structure or a building, engineering works, mining or other operation in, on, over or under land, or the making of any material change of use in the land or buildings. So often the safest place to start in working out whether you need planning permission is to assume that all buildings, operations and changes of use do need a planning application to be submitted to the local authority. You know, you should seek advice from the local planning authority as to whether a planning application is required. But I'm going to provide you with a bit of advice here, so that you've got a general idea, a bit of an aid memoir really, as to whether you need planning permission. There's not, I must say that there's not much guidance on this area, and there is a reason for that. It's quite difficult to explain all of the secondary legislation around this. There's a number of criteria and conditions, and sort of defining whether a structure is development even is a matter of fact and degree. So it's in individual cases need to be assessed. But as I said, it is the local authority's decision. So when we're talking about structures, you know, your basic polytunnels, sheds, I suppose raised beds could be engineering operations or classed as little structures. You know, you start off with the position, I suppose, of are they development, and it's a bit of a grey area. Perhaps the structure here in the green polytunnel, that sort of thing, I would say, you know, generally that is more of a sort of small structure that wouldn't amount to development. But then, you know, this sort of thing in the bottom left corner is probably a bit more of a grey area, and maybe local planning authorities would say that is development that requires planning permission. Raised beds, that again is a matter of fact and degree, and you know, you need to look at the scale and height of the, you know, and the area covered really, to think about whether it is development that requires planning permission. And I've had a handy email recently from an officer, a senior officer at Swansea Council, who suggested that 7 raised beds, 60 centimetres high, 1.2 meters wide and 2.4 meters long, 7 of those wouldn't, he'd be surprised if a planning officer anywhere would consider that to be development that requires planning permission. But always think about speaking to the local planning authority first, and there is a formal process that you can do to ask that question, and it's called an application for certificate of lawful development. So if you really want to make sure that your proposed development doesn't need planning permission, that's what you need, certificate of lawful development. But there are developments that you know, don't warrant the intervention of the local planning authority, and I suppose you could say that they're not developed, they're not within the meaning of development. But always check. Engineering operations, so things like excavations for a car parking area, creation of ponds, sort of pathways and terracing on a bank where you might want to sort of create terraces for growing. Again, this is all a matter of fact and degree, looking at the height and the depth of your excavation or your operation. It's a balance really, and the local authority needs to assess. All of these things in these pictures here could amount to development, and therefore require a planning application. Just talking about permitted development rights, top left-hand corner, there's a bit of a link there. But if you Google permitted development in Wales, the Welsh part is important because England have a lot greater rights to do things without planning permission these days. They have the, you know, permitted development is very much about the automatic rights of planning permission, so you don't need a formal application. and you know, there are some limited rights. You know, householders have permitted development rights to build things in their gardens, for instance. Farmers have permitted development rights, which we will talk about. But there are some basic sort of minor permitted development rights that are useful to know about. Forms of enclosure, so that might be a gate, fence, or wall. You can build up to 1 metre in height next to a highway, so a highway that has vehicles passing on it, and 2 metres in height if you're not adjacent to a highway. Then and I should say as well, that is not the case if you're in the curtilage of a listed building. There aren't any preclusions in the national park or AMBs on that. Then there's permitted development rights for means of access. If you need to create an access to a road, a highway, not on an A or B road, I should say, in connection with another development, but not the means of enclosure part, you could be able to provide an access without needing planning permission. Now, just thinking about temporary buildings, you'll be surprised at this, some of you, because temporary buildings have, you know, it's very limited what you can do. Basically, you can have buildings or movable structures, works, or plant machinery in connection with a building operation that has planning permission. So that's where you can have, you know, like a compound or something like that in association with development. And then the 28-day sort of rule, where you can have, you can use land for up to 28 days in a calendar year without planning permission. There are some preclusions, not in a triple SI, which is a sort of European ecological sort of designation of land where there's protected species. You can't do it this 28 days. You can't use land for 28 days in a calendar year if it's in association with motorsports, clay pigeon shooting, war games, or adverts. So it's a bit random, but yeah, those are the things. Those are the only ways that you can have temporary buildings. So this business of sort of looking at whether, say, a polytunnel is a temporary building because it might not be attached to the ground or something like that. What you're talking about there really is, does it amount to development, not whether it's a temporary building or not. Right, moving on. Change of use. I don't know if any of you know this community supported agriculture scheme that Tom O'Kane runs down on the Gower. Fantastic example of community supported agriculture. So horticulture is agriculture, and agriculture is not within the meaning of development. So in my view, there's never a question as to whether you need planning permission for agriculture. And there is case law around this. You know, if you want to start growing fruit and vegetables, or flowers, or, you know, anything on a piece of land, then that isn't development and it doesn't need planning permission. It's when we get into the, you know, structures side of things, buildings, that you know, you may need permission. And of course operations as well, like things like ponds that we discussed as well. So there are things, if the main use of your farm, if you like, is agriculture, there are things that you can do that are ancillary to that main use. So for instance, a farm shop selling your own produce is something that's mentioned in some Welsh Government guidance, Technical Advice Note 6, that sort of states that planning permission wouldn't be required for a change of use there. But when you're thinking about perhaps opening a farm shop where you're bringing in lots of produce from outside the farm, then that's something that might tip the balance in terms of a change of use. Also, things like operating a business from home. Well, a lot of us, we're all doing that at the moment, aren't we? You can do that sort of thing because it's ancillary to the main use of the building as a house in a lot of instances. So, it's a matter of fact and degree. And it has to be sort of amount to a material change of use where perhaps that use is overtaking the main use that's there at the moment. So, for instance, things like training and education often comes up with some farming operations. If you want to bring in people to learn from what's going on the site, well, normally, doing that sort of thing at a low level is classed as ancillary. But if you're sort of setting up a school or a college on the site, then obviously you're going into the realms of a change of use there. So, and just remember, the local authority decides, and you should always seek their advice. So, talking now about Part 6 of the General Permitted Development Order, 1995. And this is the part specifically that has changed quite a lot in England. So if you hear colleagues and friends talking about what they're allowed to do on their farms in England, it's completely different now in Wales. Our rights haven't changed since 1995, and I have been canvassing Welsh Government Planning Division to update these rights. Yeah, we continue on that point. But yeah, we're dealing with the regs as in 1995, Part 6 of the order. Yeah, anything over 5 hectares, if you're on a farming operation or an agricultural holding, as a lot of people call it, which is over 5 hectares in size, or 12.4 acres, you have a fair amount more rights to do things than if you were on a farm that's under 5 hectares. And I'll touch on some of the new rights for community growers. If you've got any element of your farm that's led by community, you do have some limited rights to build very small structures as well. So now, what you can do on a farm that's over 5 hectares, you can build new structures up to 465 square meters, or about 5,000 square foot. You can also alter or extend existing buildings, unless it's a significant extension. I think that's written in there. And you can carry out engineering operations like ponds and excavations for terracing or car parking areas, for instance. You can do all that under permitted development, and it doesn't need planning permission. For new buildings, you do need to submit a prior notification application to the local authority to see if they want you to submit a full planning application for the works. The prior notification application is a small application, not much details required. It's a small fee of about £100, and the authority has 28 days in which to start to decide that planning application. Otherwise, the rights are sort of deemed that you've got you don't need to submit a prior approval application, a full planning application. So it's only 28 days, so it's a much shorter, smaller sort of process, and that's for new buildings. Now, in national park areas and certain areas around Snowdonia National Park, you have to submit a prior notification for all development that you want to do. So that includes alterations and extensions and engineering operations. So the local authority can decide if they want you to submit a full planning application. So moving on to what you can do on a farm that's under 5 hectares, you can't build new structures, do engineering operations without full planning permission. This is the area of planning that I'd like to see changed, really, because there's obviously a big push policy-wise for horticulture to be, in local food production in Wales, and a lot of horticultural operations are on land under 5 hectares, and it doesn't seem right that still you need a full planning application for things that your fellow farmers working on land over 5 hectares can do without planning permission. So you can extend and alter existing structures, and you can do sort of hard surfaces and pathways. In the national park, even alterations or extensions need a prior notification application to check whether the National Park Authority would like you to submit a full planning application for those works. As I've mentioned, there are some very new planning permitted development rights, which I only found out about this morning, thanks to colleagues in Outdoor Recreation Division at Welsh Government. There's some very limited permitted development rights for community-led growing areas, where if you're sort of, well, you can basically build a shed up to 6 square meters without planning permission. And if you're on land over 125 square meters, you can have a shed and a polytunnel up to 6 square meters. So it's not it's very limited. But I just thought I'd mention that there is that part. If you've got a community-led part to your operation. Right, that's all the stuff on whether you need planning permission for things. Are there questions around that particular aspect? Once we've done those, we'll move on then to getting planning permission.
Alison, I'm just looking at the question that you sent in advance, and I'm wondering if Lucie's answered that question for you. It was about,
yes.
Yeah, has that answered that for you?
Yeah, because it was, the fact is the farm is,
grazing.
it's 250 acres. So
yeah, there you go. And it's agriculture, isn't it? Whether it's horticulture or grazing, it's agriculture.
It's a field, that's a small field next to the farmhouse. So that answers the question, really. It's because the Vale Council are just very pernickety.
Yeah, they can do.
Funny enough, we applied for planning permission to put up just side extensions on the shed for the sheep, for lambing. They even made us, we thought, they'd just say, yeah, go ahead. But they made us put in full planning just to put 2 side extensions on the shed.
Today.
Yeah, they're really, really, really on you, so.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the Vale as well.
Yeah.
I've forgotten to mention that there are a number of criteria and conditions that are attached, even if you don't, if you don't need planning permission. You have to submit this prior notification application, and then a number of conditions around things like you can't be within 400 meters of the farmhouse and things like that. That's an important aspect to mention that I forgot. Sorry.
So if you put a polytunnel, it's got to be further than 400 meters. Is that what you're saying?
Sorry, yeah, that's if you're wanting to put slurry or livestock in the building. Yeah, this is different. Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I don't know whether to pass. I'll ask this at the end, but another question was on about doing workshops at the farm, but I'll pass this at the end.
Yeah, I mean, if you're just wanting to do workshops, it might well be a very small aspect to the main use there as a farm.
Yeah.
And considered ancillary. Yeah. It's best to mention it to a local authority. Just jot them an email and say, look, we're thinking about doing this. This use. And it's always better to do things in advance, because the fees surrounding planning applications can be greater if you've already started works.
Yeah, I totally understand that. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
All right.
There's a couple come through the chat box, Lucy.
Okay.
Is there anything coming on in terms of sustainable drainage systems?
Yeah. Actually, remind me if I haven't mentioned it at the end. But when you do a planning application over 100 square meters, at the moment, a sustainable drainage application needs to be submitted to the SAB part of the local authority. So yeah, it's a separate application that requires investigative works around percolation rates, how much rain is going to fall off buildings. They don't want you to have rainwater going into public sewers, surface water going into public sewers anymore. So it's best to try and provide information if you're over 100 square meters surrounding where that water is going to soak away to and how.
Okay, thank you. I'll as I say, if there's any more about that, we'll give you a nudge at the end. And John's asking if there's a case study document available on types of farm shops or roadside honesty box food stalls. Is there anything on the social farms?
No. Yeah. What in terms of what needs planning permission or what hasn't needed planning permission?
Both, I suppose. What does and what doesn't?
Yeah. No. I mean, what I should mention, and I might mention as we go on, is that if you sort of Google your local authority area and put planning in, you can go in and search all the planning applications that have come up in your area. And I did it yesterday. I just typed in barn for the type of development in Ceredigion, and all these applications came up relating to barn conversions or new barn structures. So that might be something, you know, you could look at in your local authority area. Just type in you know, where it says view or search planning applications, click on that, and then type in, you know, something like farm shop, and see how those applications have been assessed. There's always an officer report attached to each planning decision, and that's a useful guide for how planning applications are assessed. That officer report, I find them very helpful.
Okay, thank you. And Andy Cook, I know that you've sent some questions in advance as well, Andy. I might actually get you to do a one-to-one with Lucy because it's quite specific, but through the chat here, I don't know if you're going to touch on this, Lucy, timescales for planning permissions.
Yeah, so for minor development, polytunnels and things like that, you're talking 8 weeks really from validation. So we'll talk about it as we go on now. Okay. It does come up.
And then if you want to collect rainwater runoff from guttering, etc., and store it, are there planning permissions needed? I suppose for those big those big tanks, is there planning needed?
Oh yeah, the bigger tanks. Yeah, they could be classed as an engineering operation or a structure, depending on scale and size. I've seen a very big one up in Machynlleth actually on a growing site up there, which perhaps might have needed planning permission. But you know, your average water butt doesn't need permission. No, it's a good question of scale and height, and it's worth asking a question to the local authority. Okay.
Andy, I'll come back to your other questions either at the end or, as I say, put you in touch with Lucy and you can have that one-to-one if that's okay.
Yeah.
But for now, I'll let you carry on.
That's fine, thank you.
Thank you.
Was there anything else? What about One Planet Development? oh, there's a few things coming through now. One Planet Development, this is Wales only thing and seems a bit inconsistent with Welsh Government support OPD principles, but yet for horticulture under 5 hectares, you have to submit full planning. So One Planet Development is a very complicated process that requires full planning permission. You need to submit a management plan which goes beyond my area of expertise. You have to show that within 5 years you're going to be eating off the land and living off the land by a level of 80% within 5 years, and they want to know everything relating to that. So you need like a farming consultant or an agricultural consultant to help you work out those things, and there are people that do specialize in One Planet Development. I have to say it's not something I specialize in, but I do know that you need full planning permission for it, and it's very controversial, lots of appeals that can go either way. Yeah, that's all I need to say really about One Planet Development, I think. Planning permission, listed building consent for a polytunnel in the culture of a listed building. Yeah, you do need listed building consent for structures within the culture of a listed building, so you would need both generally. If both planning permission and listed building consent, if you don't fit in within the remit of development, if your structure is development and doesn't have planning permitted development rights within the realms of what we've talked about, then you need to submit both applications. Yeah. Yeah, the Welsh Government website's got there's something called Planning Policy Wales. I think we're on edition 10 now of that document. That's a useful starting point. We can talk about that a bit further on. Can you define hard surfaces, trackways under PDRs a bit more clearly? So there are permitted development rights to provide. We talked about an access in association with perhaps another sort of hard surfacing area. You can have hard surfaces and trackways if you're on land on a farming operation over 5 hectares. But you can also create an access under the minor operations side of permitted development. You could create an access point to a highway. But if you're on land under 5 hectares, then it's going to be more difficult to get sort of an access way, well, not an access way, I should say, a pathway or a road without planning permission. I do have you. Where are we? Yeah, David Thorpe is a chap that does a lot of work on One Planet Development. But if you Google One Planet Development, there's lots of stuff on there around the One Planet Council. Right, let's go down. I do to ask. We'll ask them some more questions at the end, or have a one-to-one. It's no problem. How about temporary accommodation over 12.4 acres? Temporary accommodation in association with construction works and the 28-day rule apply everywhere, not just on a farm over 5 hectares or under 5 hectares. They apply everywhere. It's about what you can do anywhere in terms of construction and having it like a compound area, and also using land for 28 days. I think there's a restriction, which I talked about, in national parks or listed buildings. But yeah, it doesn't matter if you're on land over 5 hectares there. Yeah, so yeah, the polytunnel thing is very much around whether you are on farms over 5 hectares. You can build these new structures without planning permission. You have to submit a prior notification application. But if you're on land under 5 hectares, then you need full planning permission. Okay, should we move on? Time's ticking by. Questions? So let's move on. See if I can move the slide on. Right. Getting planning permission. Now, with getting planning permission, it's important to start right, and if you do start right, getting planning permission can be a lot easier than if you don't. So I was going to provide you with some tips and then talk about pre-application advice and how to go about submitting a plan and application. These are some tips that I thought you might find of interest. So you don't need to own land to get planning permission on it. So if you're, I don't know, looking for land or looking at prospective land that you might want to get a lease or own, you could submit a planning application on that site without actually owning it, as long as you serve a notice on the owner of the land and sign the correct certificate with your planning application forms. The objection of neighbours doesn't necessarily impact on the planning decision, because objections have to be material planning considerations. They could say, oh, I don't like Mr. Smith and he carried out this crime 5 years ago and I think you should be aware of it. That's not a planning consideration. We'll talk about what are planning considerations, but just to say what your neighbours say doesn't necessarily mean the application will be refused. The planning officer has a duty to consider those representations, as they're called, but they don't always mean the application will be refused. You can withdraw an application at any time if you're thinking if it's likely the application is going to be refused. Sometimes strategically it's better to withdraw that application and submit another one free of charge, I should say. A similar application within 1 year it is free of charge. And sometimes people choose to withdraw the application and submit another one without having to pay that extra fee. You can submit as many applications at the same time or one after another. So this is something that housing developers do quite a lot. If they've got an optimum scheme that they want to go for, but they haven't really got time to wait for that application to be refused and then go to appeal, etc., etc. So they'll submit maybe another application, which is perhaps less controversial. So you could do the same thing. You know, if you've got a shed that you really got your eye on, or you feel that perhaps might have a bit more impact in the landscape, you could submit one that's slightly less impactful. And then what happens is sometimes you can choose then for that one application that you're really keen on, and the optimum scheme, you can appeal the decision of the local planning authority if they refuse it. And then the other one, you can work on the basis of as that's your backup plan. Now, outline planning and permission is becoming a little bit, well, far less used these days. Full planning permission is by far the most sort of popular way of applying for planning permission. Outline planning permission just gives you the principle of development, with some other things like where you're going to get your access from. So just looking at the planning fees, pre-application advice is a statutory process. All local planning authorities have to provide it under a statutory process. Some offer discretionary planning advice, similar sort of fees really, but certainly if you're wanting to do something that is under half a hectare, so that's, we're talking about floor space now of the new building, go for pre-application advice every time, £250. And I would recommend going for pre-application advice. It's important, but we'll talk about that a little bit further. The local development plan is key. Do your homework, have a look at the policies in that plan. Every local authority in Wales now has a local development plan. Some are updating their local development plans because they're getting a little bit out of date, but they all have a local development plan, and that policy is like your Bible, really. It's your starting point for assessing a planning application. So if you're wanting to put up a new structure for storage or whatever in a national park, have a look at the policies that you know, they're very useful documents to have a look at prior to even thinking about certainly taking on a piece of land or putting any investment into new structures or engineering operations. So yeah, those are some tips before you start. Pre-application advice, as I said, is statutory. They have local authorities have 21 days in which to respond. I think they can ask you for an extension of that time, but you know, it can be quite a swift process. There are statutory fees, as we've mentioned, depending on the floor space that you're talking about. You should provide as much detail as possible. Local planning authorities won't even entertain the idea of giving you any idea of where the planning permission is likely without seeing some sort of location and layout plan of what you're intending to do. So you know, make a start on either doing, if you feel you're capable of your own layout plan, or employing someone to do some plans for you, because it's, you know, you're going to need to do them for your planning application. So that's something to invest in early on, because it's very difficult to talk to local authorities at all without some sort of idea of a location plan and a layout plan. That's your basics. Right. Another bit of your homework, as I've mentioned, you can go in and have a look at your, you could Google, say, Ceredigion planning decisions, or just Ceredigion planning. Up will come a page where you want to search and look through previous planning application decisions. You can look at the history of your site for previous planning applications, and also of, you know, application planning decisions in the locality. If you've got a particular area, ward, you can type in that area and have a look what decisions have been made in that area and how they were assessed. Look at the officer report and see what policies are mentioned, and then you sort of move on to looking at those policies in the local development plan. There will be policies for development in the countryside. Just to provide a bit of starting point, there's in planning, there's settlement boundaries drawn around every sort of urban area, and that's where development is directed towards. So anything in the countryside locations, there's strict controls on development. Otherwise, we wouldn't have our green countryside as we have here in Wales that we've got now. It would be absolute chaos, buildings going up all over the place. So it is strictly controlled in the countryside, and for good reason. Have a look at those policies and see what types of development would be considered, and also what the policies are, the criteria, you know, what sort of things are they're going to be considering. Yeah, the local development plan can be accessed on the local authority website. So if you put in Carmarthenshire local development plan, it'll come up. Just click on some of the first results. Local authorities also provide things like supplementary planning guidance, particularly in national parks. I've noticed there's additional guidance documents on things like farm diversification, any potential impacts on the special character of the national parks. And these are really informative documents as to how you should go about putting your planning application scheme together. So yeah, recommend you have a look at those policies and supplementary planning guidance as well. We'll talk about some material planning considerations, but basically the local authority has to, when they receive a planning application, they validate it, make sure that all the documents, forms and everything are there, and drawings, and then once they're happy, they will allocate the application to a planning officer, and as they start to consider that application, the first thing they will do is look at the policies in the local development plan, and then any supplementary planning guidance, and then there'll be other material planning considerations which we will talk about. But do get the opinion of an officer. Get your pre-application advice in. It's worth the money. But if you haven't got time, you can, with local development plans, you can perhaps email the planning policy team and just ask them what policies would apply, and then you can have a read of those policies. That's a good thing to do as a starting point if you don't want to pay the sort of £250, or you haven't got a huge amount of time. Right, submitting a planning application, you need to make sure all your plans and information are as requested. You have to submit a fee. Do it on the planning portal. That's an online facility really for you to submit planning applications. That's what I use. It's very self-explanatory, takes you through each stage of the planning application forms and the information that would be required for that specific type of development, and then it'll tell you what the fee is, the certificates you need to sign. There's a validation process. Once you've submitted that application, administration officers within the local authority will look at that and make sure all the information is provided. From that date of registration, you'll get a planning application number, and it will be passed to the planning officer, and that's where your 8-week clock starts ticking. They have 8 weeks in which to try to determine the planning application within. And if they don't, they need to ask for an extension of time. They ask the applicant for an extension of time, but that they have specific targets to meet. They have to have a certain amount of planning applications determined within 8 weeks. So they do try very much to try and get your application determined within 8 weeks. It's 16 weeks for major planning applications, but I think what we're talking about here, the scale of things, it'll be sort of storage buildings and polytunnels and that sort of thing. So it would be 8 weeks. Just moving on quickly, see these are some of the development plan policy considerations. As I said, check those policies in the plan. There are other sort of material planning considerations, but these are the ones that most come up or are examples of things that I would consider first off, really. And the local authority will be looking to make sure your scheme complies with. As I said, development in the countryside is strictly controlled, and you do need to prove that your structure or engineering operation, be it a polytunnel, a pond, car parking area, it's reasonably necessary for the farming operation that you've got on that land. Is it an essential need? That will be probably the first thing a planning officer mentions in their officer report. You know, can they justify this building in the countryside? Also, is it something that's justified in terms of the rural economy? Is it adding to the needs of the rural community? Siting design and external appearance do very much sort of come into it, and the potential intrusion in the landscape, and that's very important in national parks. I'll come back to that in a second, but just to mention as well, impact on the amenities of neighbours. You know, the most sort of famous popular sort of example in Wales is chicken sheds. You know, if you've got a next door neighbour who's next to a chicken shed, those the impact on the amenities of your neighbouring property are going to be probably quite high. So there, those sorts of things. But you know, just putting a polytunnel is obviously not going to have a very big impact on your neighbours, unless you know it's something that is obscuring their views of the particular landscape. Impact on the habitats and biodiversity, that's just something to think about in terms of sustainable agriculture, making sure that if you're putting a new structure up on a bit of land that hasn't been developed before, there may well be protected species on that land, and you shouldn't disturb land without thinking about potential protected species, and speak to your local authority biodiversity officer or countryside department, speak to the planning officer to see if they'll need a biodiversity assessment with your application. The biggest things really are, I suppose, any potential conversions of buildings, bats and barn owls that are safeguarded by law. Just going back to national parks, there's a big consideration in terms of the natural beauty in that area and the impact on the landscape. The impact on the landscape is always considered, but in national parks, there's a particular sort of purpose in terms of natural beauty, wildlife, and cultural heritage. So, you know, you've got to think about conserving and enhancing those special qualities within the national park. So just try and be sensitive with your development in terms of the height and scale and design. Try to perhaps provide some soft landscaping trees to reduce the impacts in the landscape, and don't build things on the on the horizon where they're going to be sticking out like a sore thumb. But you know, the development of this type isn't precluded in national parks, so it's just best to get an idea of the type of siting and design really that might be preferable when you're dealing with the local planning authority. So get some pre-application advice. The other thing as well, in national parks, they may ask you to prove the future sustainability of the farming operation, especially if you're going to be doing something completely new. They will ask you to perhaps provide a small business plan or some sort of future idea of financial sustainability, just so they can justify whether this building is essential and reasonably necessary. But yeah, I'll finish there, and opportunity for some questions. Lots to take in.
There is one that came through the chat actually from Ali. What if the neighbours support the application? Would that make a difference to your planning permission?
Same thing really, as if they object. But it's always useful to have the support of your neighbours, and that's something that is I would say is good practice really. Have a chat with your neighbours if they're in close proximity prior to submitting your application, so that there's no myths or misconstrued information about what you're going to be doing. And it's just good practice really to speak to your neighbours. If they say something positive, it doesn't necessarily mean the application will be approved. The planning officer has the same set of sort of development plan policies and material planning considerations to think about. But if your neighbour supports, it just does provide a little bit more assurance, really.
questions that came in advance, actually. If I just ask you a question, it's from Adam. I know you're on, Adam. At what point would alteration to a gateway in a hedge require planning permission?
So, yeah, under the there's a part that I talked about in the General Permitted Development Order, where it's temporary buildings. No, it's not that bit. It's a bit before that. Part 2, minor operations of. It's Part 2 of the General Permitted Development Order 1995. You are able to provide an access to a highway, so an access in a hedge, not on an A or B road, in connection with other development, but not the means of enclosure part. So if you're putting up a gate, fence, wall, you can't have an access as well. But if you're doing other development, I don't know, this one is always like if you're wanting to perhaps provide a new pathway to your house, for instance. So if you're wanting to perhaps put a new pathway or road up to the farmhouse, you can have an access way put in as well. That is a minor operation that is allowed.
Okay. And if how does a 4,500 square foot buildings or polytunnel allowance work exactly?
Yeah, I saw this one prior. It says 4,500 square foot. I don't know what they're referring to there, but I know that if you're on land over 5 hectares, if your farm's over 5 hectares, you can build up to 5,000 square feet, 5,005 square feet to be precise,
Okay.
or 465 square meters. So that actual figure I've not seen, and I did check the General Permitted Development Order. It's not something that comes up.
I mean, what I would suggest is, I mean, because, we're at 5 o'clock now, and there's just another question that's come through, but which I will ask you. But I'm just thinking that there might be an opportunity. What we've done previously with some of the horticultural networks is that we've done drop-in surgeries, whereby people wouldn't have to stay for the whole hour. They could just come in, ask their question, and maybe listen to what other people are asking for as long as they've got time, and then kind of drop out. So it's a kind of drop in and out, which is quite nice. It's more difficult for you, Lucy, because you're answering loads of questions. But it's great for people to not have to sit through an hour of stuff that might not be relevant to them. So that might be something to explore for us going forward.
Yeah.
And also, I know that Sarah's put the survey in the chat box. If people wouldn't mind completing that or coming back to me with future requests for either, further planning sessions or other training, that's really helpful to us, because it means that we can then put things on that are led by you as the sector. But again, I'll return to the one-to-one sessions. If there's specifics that you want to know about, then we can set up those one-to-one sessions with Lucy, which I think for some people would be really useful. So as I said, just we know about you, Andy. We'll set that up for you. But if there's anybody else, either come to me or come to the Tuvy team, and we'll set that up for you as well. Just to go back to a question from John, do planning officers / Welsh Gov anticipate an increase in farm diversification applications when the farm subsidy system changes and additional income streams are required?
Yeah, I mean, it is actually something I've posed to Planning Division beginning of last week about, this intention from Leslie Griffiths, the Minister, to have more local food production and supplies of, and horticultural development. And also, there will be lots of farm diversification proposals. And I think local authorities would benefit from additional, certainly, guidance as to how these applications should be dealt with. Agriculture itself in the main planning policy document for Wales is only mentioned a few times. There is a technical advice note 6 which talks about planning for sustainable rural communities. It's an out-of-date document in my view, and it does really need to be updated, because we are going to have this influx of different types of planning applications, because obviously the whole system is changing, isn't it, in terms of farming subsidies, and also just in terms of COVID-19 and climate change emergency. There's and farming operations, smaller farming operations and horticultural operations need to be encouraged. So yeah, it'd be great if we could have a bit more guidance from Welsh Government Planning Division, but we'll see. I'm sure they're thinking about it.
Well, we're just after 5, and I think we could go on and on really, but thank you, Lucy. So much information and really informative, and as I said, a subject that people are really interested in, and it's obviously something that we need to know about going forward. So
it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks very much. And as I said, it will be on the Knowledge Hub area of the Tyfu Cymru website. Lots of thanks coming through on the chat box.
I can see some of them coming through. Yeah.
Really nice. Thank you, everybody.
It's hard to cover it all. There's certainly some criteria and conditions that I haven't mentioned. So don't take my word for everything, but it's just a bit of guidance for you, really. To go about sort of before you start development.
And I think we'll look at some future sessions as well, whether it be that drop-in or a further session from this with a bit more detail, maybe in specific areas. But
sure.
If you just come back to us and let us know what you want as farm businesses, then we can look at developing that for you. So go and all have your dinner now.
Yeah.
And,